The air stank of rust and blood. That was the first truth I learned when the gates closed behind me. Not the smell of iron alone, but of sweat cooked under torches, of flesh opened too many times, of prayers whispered too quietly for the Emperor to hear. We were herded forward like cattle, though none of us believed we would ever see the slaughterhouse so quickly. The guards' boots clanged on the grated walkways above, a constant reminder of who owned us, of who laughed at the spectacle. Their voices carried like iron rods striking bone. Sharp, cruel, uncaring. Somewhere beyond the walls, a crowd roared. It was not a cheer of joy. It was hunger, the kind only blood could feed. I had thought the Imperium vast, eternal, and holy. But here, inside the pits, the truth showed itself bare. We were nothing but fuel for its cruelty. The Emperor protects, they said. But he did not protect us from this. The fighting pit stretched out before me, a circle of stones scarred by centuries of death. The sand underfoot was not sand at all. It was powdered bone, mixed with blood that had soaked deep into the cracks, clung to my skin, sticky, sweet with rot. Above us, cages rattled with prisoners waiting their turn. Some prayed, others laughed, already mad. A few sang hymns that broke halfway through, their voices cracking under the weight of terror. And then the sound, the deep tolling of a bell. Each strike rolled like thunder through the stone walls. The audience howled in answer. We were chosen. We were nothing. We were theirs. I remember the faces around me. A deserter from the guard, his uniform still half clinging to him, torn and bloodied. A woman who had stolen bread for her child, her crime enough for the Arbites to throw her here. A priest who had preached the Emperor's mercy too loudly, too kindly, and was now condemned to prove faith through agony. And me? I had not even understood my crime. That was the cruelty of it. Perhaps it had been nothing at all. Perhaps it was simply that the pits always needed fresh meat. The gate across the arena groaned open. From the shadows, something stepped forward. Not a man, not a beast, a mixture of both. A pit fighter kept alive long past reason. His body stitched with scars and crude augmetics. His eyes glowed faintly with the flicker of failing optics. His jaw was metal, clicking when he breathed. He carried no blade. His hands were blades, rusted hooks grafted where fingers should have been. The crowd adored him. They screamed his name, though I could not make it out through the roar. He had killed before. He would kill again. And we were expected to entertain them with our deaths. I wanted to believe there was strategy, that if we worked together we might survive. But already I saw the fear unraveling us. The deserter shoved the priest aside, scrambling to the edge as if he could scale the pit wall. The woman clutched a jagged rock she had found in the dirt, her eyes wild with desperation. And me? My hands shook so badly I could not close them into fists. The beast man smiled with his broken metal jaw. The first scream came quickly. The deserter had tried to climb, but the crowd above reached down, grabbing at him with eager hands. They tore him down as though his body were a prize, and the beastman's hook split him open before he touched the ground. The crowd roared approval. Blood sprayed across the sand, painting the bone powder red. That was the moment we understood. There was no escape. The pit had only one law: you kill or you are killed. And yet, there was more. The fight was not the end. The fight was the beginning, because as I raised my hands, trembling, and faced the beastman with nothing but fear, I saw the overseers in their gilded seats above. Their armor gleamed with aquilas and purity seals. They were priests, nobles, officers, men of the Imperium. They watched with the same hunger as the mob. And I realized the cruelest truth. This was not chaos. This was not Xenos. This was the Imperium itself. The bell tolled again. The hooks flashed in torchlight. The crowd screamed for blood. And the fighting pits swallowed us whole. But that was only the beginning. The first thing that struck me was the smell. Not the sharp tang of metal you get when you cut yourself. Not the faint iron you taste when you bite your lip. No, this was heavier, thicker. It was rust baked into the air. Sweat turned sour. Blood turned sweet. The torches along the walls burned fat-soaked wicks that spat greasy smoke into our lungs. The whole place felt alive, like we were breathing in the ghosts of the dead. They pushed us through the gates with rifle butts and shock prods. A dozen of us stumbling forward in chains. We were a miserable collection of flesh. Starved, beaten, terrified. Each step clattered with the sound of iron around our ankles. Some tried to look brave. Most only looked broken. Above, on the grated walkways, boots thudded. Guards leaned on their rifles, watching us the way you might watch pack animals. Their laughter fell like pebbles into our ears, light and careless, as though our fear was a kind of entertainment before the real show even began. And there was a crowd, Emperor save me, a crowd. The walls of the pit were high, ringed with stone and steel, but above those walls the people gathered. Row upon row, shouting, shrieking, baying for blood. It was not joy, not delight. It was hunger, raw and desperate, the kind that only violence could feed. The ground underfoot was not sand. We had thought it would be. From stories, from old tales whispered in back alleys, we imagined sand and dust. But this was worse. It crunched beneath our bare feet like gravel. It was pale, off-white, clinging to sweat-slick skin. Powdered bone. Ground so fine it stained the cracks of your toes. And within it, dark streaks of dried blood hardened into veins that had turned the ground itself into a corpse. I tried not to think about whose bones they were. I failed. The sound of the crowd rose, a wave crashing down on us. They stamped their feet. They clashed metal cups against railings. They screamed words I could not understand at first. 1,000 voices merging into a single demand. Fight, fight, fight. The torches flared as if in answer. Chains rattled above as cages swayed. I looked up and saw the others who had come before us. Prisoners packed tight, waiting their turn. Their faces pressed against the bars. Some prayed, whispering desperate pleas to the emperor, lips moving so quickly the words blurred into nonsense. Others laughed. A wild, broken laughter that spilled out of them like blood from an open wound. A few sang hymns that started strong but faltered, cracked, and died in their throats as if faith itself could not survive this place. I felt my own lips move, but no words came. My tongue was ash. Then the bell tolled. It was not a clean sound, not bright or holy. It was heavy, rusted, dull. The kind of sound that did not just strike your ears but crawled into your bones. Each toll was followed by the howl of the crowd, a 1,000-voiced echo that rattled my chest and made my teeth ache. The gate across the arena groaned open. Shadows stretched long across the pit floor as something moved within. First I thought it was a man, then I thought it was a beast, and then I realized it was neither. He was stitched together from scars and metal. His chest was broad, his muscles swollen, but his flesh sagged in places where it had been cut too many times. His eyes glowed faintly with a sickly green light, crude augmetics wired directly into the skull. One of them sparked, flickering, but it did not matter. His jaw was gone, replaced by a frame of steel that clicked with each breath. His arms ended in hooks, rusted and jagged, grafted where fingers should have been. Every movement groaned like a machine that should have been put to rest long ago. The crowd loved him. They screamed his name. It rolled like thunder around the arena, but I could not catch the syllables. Only the force of it, the way it shook the ground. He raised his arms, hooks gleaming in the torchlight, and the mob screamed louder. This was no man. This was a relic of cruelty. A beast kept alive only to kill again. I glanced at the others around me. There was a deserter from the guard, still wearing half a uniform torn and stiff with dried blood. He clutched his arms around himself like a child, muttering about orders, about comrades, about things long gone. There was a woman who had stolen bread. Bread, nothing more. Her hair hung in tangled ropes around her face. Her hands shook so violently she could barely close them into fists. There was a priest, his robes shredded, the Aquila still pinned crooked to his chest. He had been condemned not for heresy, but for mercy, for preaching kindness where cruelty was expected. His lips moved even now, whispering a prayer so quiet only he and the emperor could hear. And me? I did not even know my crime. That was the cruelest truth. Perhaps I had done nothing. Perhaps I had simply been chosen. The pits always needed flesh. The deserter broke first. He tried to run, stumbling toward the pit wall as if he could climb it. His nails tore against the stone, scrabbling like a rat in a cage. The crowd above reached for him, not to save him but to pull him down. Their hands clawed his scalp, ripped his arms, dragged him from the wall and threw him back into the arena. The beast was waiting. The hook came down once, clean and heavy. The deserter split open like a sack of grain. Blood sprayed high, staining the pale bone dust red. His scream cut short, swallowed by the roar of the mob. They cheered as though he had given them a gift. That was the moment we all understood. There was no escape. The pit had only one law: you kill or you die. The priest fell to his knees, praying louder now. His voice cracked, hoarse, desperate, calling on the emperor to watch, to shield, to do something. The woman found a jagged rock in the dust. She held it tight, her knuckles white, her whole body trembling. And me, I could barely close my hands into fists. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it would split open before the hooks touched me. The beast man tilted his head. His metal jaw clicked like laughter. And then, as I raised my trembling hands, I looked up. Above the mob, above the cages, in the high seats of iron and gold, sat the overseers. Their armor gleamed with aquilas and purity seals. Priests in red and black robes. Nobles draped in cloth of gold. Officers of the guard, their caps pulled low, their medals shining. They watched with hunger equal to the mob. They leaned forward, smiling, laughing, gesturing for more blood. And I realized the truth. This was not chaos. This was not Xenos. This was not the enemy from without. This was the Imperium itself. The great, holy Imperium of man, my Imperium, had made this place. And we were its fuel. The bell tolled again. The crowd screamed. The hooks flashed in the firelight. And the fighting pits swallowed us whole. But that was only the beginning. They tell you the fighting pits have always been here. That they were carved into the bedrock before the hive spires rose above them. Before the cathedrals reached for the sky. Before the manufactorums belched their first smoke into the heavens. The old men say the ground itself remembers the blood. That if you dig deep enough, you'll find bones older than the Imperium, stacked like bricks, holding up the hive itself. But that is only the story. The truth, as always, is far crueler. The pits began as punishment. That much even the priests will admit. Long ago, when this world was still half wild and the Emperor's light had only just reached it, the governors needed a way to break the people. The colony was new, fragile. Too many mouths, too little food, too much unrest. So they built walls of stone and iron, not to protect but to cage. The first pits were nothing but shallow holes dug into the earth, where rebels and thieves were thrown with nothing but rocks to fight with. It was supposed to be an execution, nothing more, a warning to the others. But the crowd gathered. The settlers came at first out of curiosity, then hunger, then habit. They cheered as the condemned tore each other apart. They threw down scraps of food to the victor, laughing as the blood soaked into the soil. And the governors watched and saw something useful. Fear alone could not hold a world. But fear mixed with spectacle, that could bind the people tighter than any chain. So the pits grew. Stone walls were carved deeper. Iron gates hammered into place. Seats built for those who wished to watch without risk of being touched by the filth below. The condemned were brought in chains, sometimes for crimes, sometimes for nothing at all. A stolen loaf, a misplaced word, a prayer whispered too quietly, enough to mark you as fuel for the arena. And the people came in droves. Because when you have nothing, no bread, no shelter, no future, you will take what you can. And blood was free. The priests wrapped it in scripture soon after. They claimed it was a trial of faith. That the emperor himself watched over the pits, judging the strength of men's souls by how they fought and how they died. They said those who perished screaming were weak and unworthy. That those who killed swiftly, without hesitation, were vessels of his will. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. I remember the murals they painted along the pit walls, Crude depictions of saints swinging swords, angels watching from the heavens, the emperor seated upon his golden throne with his hand raised in blessing. But look closer, and you would see the paint was flaking. The faces of the saints were smeared with smoke. The angels had eyes gouged out, replaced with stains of blood. Faith was a mask, and underneath it the rot spread. The first great champion was a man named Sargon the Black. Once a guardsman, dishonored and cast out, he was thrown into the pits with nothing but a broken sword. They say he killed 12 men that day. He tore one apart with his bare hands when the blade snapped. The crowd adored him. They chanted his name until the walls shook. The governor had meant for his death to be an example, but instead, Sargon became a legend. He fought for years, his body scarred and mangled, until he could no longer walk without dragging one leg behind him. They say he spat at the overseer who ordered his execution. They say his last words were, "Kill me, but you'll never kill the pits. They belong to the people now." And he was right. After Sargon, the pits were no longer punishment. They were entertainment. Merchants paid bribes to have slaves thrown in. Nobles sent rivals to die beneath the hooks. Even the Arbites grew fat on the trade, selling justice to those who could afford it, tossing the poor to the dust for even the smallest slight. The pits became a market of death. I once overheard a governor brag, "Bread feeds a man for a day, blood feeds him for a lifetime." And he was not wrong. But the people did not only come to watch, they came to forget. In the manufactorums, they coughed their lungs out from ash and smoke. In the mines, they buried their brothers under rock slides and silence. In the hab blocks, they starved while nobles feasted above. But here in the pits they could scream. They could let their hate spill free. They could watch someone else suffer, and for a brief moment, believe they were not the ones in chains. That was the genius of it, and the tragedy. It is said that, in those first centuries, the pits claimed more lives than war. Fathers were thrown in, leaving children behind to starve. Mothers bled in the dust while their sons were forced to watch from the stands. Brothers killed brothers. Lovers killed lovers. And all of it cheered, sanctified, blessed. The Arbites called it justice. The priests called it faith. The nobles called it culture. And the people, broken, starving, desperate, called it survival. But the pits did more than kill. They shaped the world itself. The cities were built around them, stone and steel radiating outward like ripples in a pool of blood. Markets thrived on pit days, selling meat, alcohol, charms, trinkets carved from the bones of the fallen. Entire families lived by scavenging the dust after the fights, searching for teeth, nails, scraps of flesh, anything that could be traded. Children played games in the alleys, pretending to be champions, swinging sticks at each other until one fell and the others roared. The pits were not just punishment, not just entertainment. They were life. I sometimes wonder, if the emperor himself had walked this world, if he had looked into the pits and seen his people tearing each other apart for scraps of bread and drops of blood, would he have turned away? Or would he have nodded in approval, saying nothing, letting it continue in silence? Because the truth is this, the Imperium did not invent cruelty. It only perfected it. And yet, even in those early days, there were whispers of something worse. Some said the pits were hungry, that the ground itself drank the blood, that it demanded more, always more. The priests said it was the emperor's judgment. But the old women in the alleys said otherwise. They whispered of shadows moving in the dust, of voices that echoed when the pits were empty, of dreams filled with claws and fire. Some said chaos had its roots here long before the first cult was named, that the pits were not simply a prison, not simply a stage, but a wound in reality itself. We did not believe it then. We could not. But the pits had already begun to grow, not only in size but in hunger, and the people, blind and desperate, fed them willingly. And so the first champions became martyrs. The first martyrs became legends. And the first legends became chains, binding us to this place forever. That is how it began. Not as a holy trial, not as a glorious tradition, but as a shallow hole in the dirt, filled with the desperate and the damned. And like all things in the Imperium, it grew until it devoured everything around it. But if the origins were cruel, the daily life that followed was worse. For once you were thrown into the pits, survival was no longer measured in years or months or even days. It was measured in minutes, and each minute was an eternity. Time does not pass in the pits the way it does on the surface. There are no clocks, no shift bells, no manufacturing sirens to divide day from night. Only the sound of chains rattling and the roar of the crowd when blood is spilled. We learned quickly that time was not measured in hours here. It was measured in fights. You were alive before a fight. You were alive if you somehow staggered out of one. You were dead if you didn't. Everything in between was waiting. We slept in cells stacked like coffin drawers, iron cages shoved into the pit walls. 8 bodies to a cell meant for 2. The stink of piss and shit was constant, soaked so deep into the stone that even when the cages were scrubbed with lye, it still lingered. Sleep itself was dangerous. If you closed your eyes too long, someone might decide you were weak enough to kill before the guards even called you down to fight. They wouldn't punish that. In fact, sometimes they encouraged it. Better to know who's soft now than in the sand, they'd say. So we slept with one eye open, if at all. The mornings, if you could call them that, began with water. Not clean water. Rust-tasting, algae-slick runoff poured into a trough we were forced to lap from like dogs. The strong drank first. The weak licked the green foam left at the edges. Sometimes a man drowned face first in the trough, and the guards laughed as we dragged his body aside. Food came after. A gray paste ladled from rusted buckets into cracked bowls. It smelled of oil and sour milk. Sometimes it wriggled. Most of us ate anyway. Hunger left no room for disgust. Bread was a rarity, handed out only before the biggest fights, a mockery of the emperor's promise of sustenance. The days were filled with waiting, endless, gnawing waiting. Some carved tally marks into the walls, counting the days since their first fight. Others prayed, knelt in the filth, whispering litanies until their lips bled. Some muttered to themselves, voices cracked, brains broken by fear and hunger. The strongest exercised obsessively, as if more muscle could hold death at bay. Push-ups in the filth, squats until their legs buckled, fists slammed into stone until knuckles split. And then there were those who did nothing, who simply sat and stared, their eyes hollow, waiting to be chosen. They were usually the first to die. Punishments were a daily ritual. If the crowd above grew restless, the guards would drag someone from a cell and beat them bloody in front of us, just to make the others scream for mercy. If 2 men fought outside the arena, they were chained together and thrown in to kill each other before the mob. If someone tried to refuse their meal, claiming they would rather starve than fight, their tongue was cut out and nailed to the wall as an example. Mercy was forbidden. Kindness was forbidden. Survival was all that mattered. And yet, small kindnesses still existed. A crust of bread slipped to a cellmate. A whispered prayer shared between strangers. A hand on a shoulder after the day's torment. We knew those acts were dangerous, that if the guards saw them, they'd punish us twice over. But in that darkness, even a crumb of humanity was brighter than any torch. And that brightness, however small, was often the thing that kept you alive. When the bell tolled, everything changed. The guards stormed the cages, unshackled chains, and shoved us toward the arena. The crowd's roar bled down into our bones long before we stepped through the gates. We never knew if we would be called. That was part of the torment. Sometimes your name was shouted for days. Fights stacked one after the other until your body was nothing but bruises and cuts. Other times, you waited weeks, each moment heavier than the last, terror grinding your sanity into dust. Waiting was worse than fighting, because in waiting you imagined it all. The blades, the claws, the hooks. You rehearsed your death again and again until you almost longed for it just to end the torment. The arena floor was a world unto itself. It reeked of scorched flesh and smoke from the torches. Beneath your feet, the bone dust crunched like snow. You could feel it grind between your teeth when you screamed. Weapons were sometimes thrown in, broken blades, jagged pipes, rusted chains. Never clean, never fair. Always enough to kill, but rarely enough to kill well. Sometimes you fought beasts, starved creatures dragged from the wastes, their eyes wild, their ribs poking through skin, dogs with augmetic jaws, two-headed groks driven mad with hunger. Sometimes you fought other prisoners, friends even, and sometimes they forced us to fight champions, pit-born monsters stitched together with augmetics, veterans who had survived so long their names became curses. The crowd ruled everything. If they wanted blood, you had to spill it. If you refused to kill, if you tried mercy, they would boo and jeer. And if the noise grew loud enough, the guards would drag you away and make sure you died screaming where the mob could see. If you killed too quickly, they jeered. They wanted a show. They wanted you to play. The pits did not begin as pits. They began as mines. Long ago, this world was not a place of blood and sand, but of stone and fire. The Imperium had come here in its endless hunger for resources, for ore and promethium, for the marrow of the earth itself. Whole generations were sent into the dark veins beneath the surface, digging until their hands were raw, their lungs blackened, their eyes filmed with dust. The miners were slaves in all but name, bound by debt, by law, by the ever-watchful eyes of the overseers. Yet even in the choking dark, men and women found ways to resist. Not open rebellion, that would have been suicide. Instead, they told stories, whispered songs, small acts of defiance passed from mouth to mouth. And when the overseers grew tired of flogging and execution, when they found that fear alone was not enough to break the spirit, they built something new. A ring, a circle carved into the stone halls, where workers who defied the order were thrown together, unarmed, and forced to fight for scraps. At first, it was punishment, a cruel diversion for the overseers who watched from above, laughing as starving miners tore at one another with bare hands. But punishment soon became tradition, and tradition soon became spectacle. They expanded the ring, hollowing out great caverns, carving stone into crude terraces for seats. They lit the place with chem lamps that hissed and spat, and when the first blood spilled on the sand, something in the crowd shifted. The lash was no longer the only tool of power. Fear was no longer the only currency. Entertainment became the chain that bound them. The pits were born. Part 2, the first crowds in the beginning, it was the overseers alone who watched. But word spreads quickly among the desperate. Workers were curious, hungry not just for food but for distraction from misery. Soon, miners begged for a place in the stands, trading rations or favors to glimpse the spectacle. It was not long before the overseers realized they had stumbled upon a weapon more potent than the whip. If suffering could be turned into theater, then obedience would follow. They began staging fights deliberately. They starved the fighters before throwing them in. They paired friends against each other, brothers against sisters, mothers against their own sons. They forced confessions in the dark, promising mercy, then betrayed every word. Each betrayal, each cruelty, became fuel for the legend of the pits. And with each scream echoing from the stone, the overseers felt their power deepen. The pits ceased to be an accident of cruelty. They became a machine, a ritual, a theater of dominance where survival was not just unlikely, it was impossible without sacrifice of the soul. Part 3. The first martyrs. There are names whispered even now in the tunnels, carried like fading sparks of memory. One was Kalen the Silent, a miner who, when thrown into the pit, refused to lift his fists. He stood still, unmoving, even as others clawed and bit. He was beaten to death while the overseers watched. Some say the crowd grew restless, uneasy. For the first time, they saw not a beast, but a man crushed under cruelty. His death seeded guilt, though it was quickly buried beneath the next roar of blood. Another was Sira of the Red Hands, a woman who strangled her overseer with the very chains that bound her wrists before being flayed alive in the ring as punishment. For a time, her story spread like fire. Mothers whispered her name to their children at night, as if saying it aloud might lend them courage. The overseers tried to erase her memory, but the pits remember. The sand remembers. And then there was the boy without a name. Some say he was no older than 12. He killed 6 men with a jagged shard of rock before being torn apart by hounds loosed into the pit. His legend endures because he fought not for survival, but because he spat at the overseers and cursed their emperor before the end. Some say that was the moment the pits became damned, cursed not only by human blood, but by defiance against the throne itself. Each of these martyrs became myth. Each became a story that added to the weight of the pits. They were not victories. They were not even tragedies in the usual sense. They were reminders. The pits had never belonged to the fighters. They belonged to those who watched, those who profited, those who found their own emptiness filled with screams. And so the roots of this place were set. It was not enough for the overseers to wield fear and hunger. They needed sanctity. They needed justification. And so the first priest came. He was not sent by Terra, nor ordained by any great cathedral. He was a broken man, once a missionary, now a servant of the overseers. They gave him scraps of parchment, a torch, a hollow podium beside the pits. His sermons were simple, brutal. The emperor tests you. The emperor watches you. Every drop of blood spilled here is in his name. The miners spat at first. They cursed him, threw stones, muttered prayers of their own. But the overseers were patient, and cruelty does not need speed to thrive. For every fighter slain, the priest declared it a sacrifice. For every scream, he claimed it was a hymn. Soon, the emperor's name was painted on the stone walls in crude black pitch. His Aquila carved into wooden gates with shaking hands. What began as mockery became habit. What began as punishment became liturgy. And so the pits were no longer just entertainment. They became holy, or rather, they became an excuse for holiness, a parody of faith, a lie told often enough that even the broken began to believe. Part 5, Expansion and Profit Cruelty has its own economy. The overseers learned that rations, weapons, even lodging could be gambled upon the fights. Men with nothing wagered what little they owned. Women bet their food, their safety, their own dignity just for a chance to win. And when the wagers grew too wild, the overseers themselves stepped in, running the books, fixing the matches, choosing who would live long enough to fight another day and who would be fed to the dogs for sport. The pits became wealth. Wealth became order. Order became the iron chain around every throat. The miners dug with heavier chains than before, not because of the emperor, not because of the lash, but because they dreamed of rations they might win by watching others die. This was the overseers' greatest triumph. They had turned the people into spectators of their own damnation. The pits no longer needed to crush rebellion. They made rebellion unthinkable. Part 6, the first great tragedy. Every legend has its collapse. For the pits, it came with the tears of ash. The story goes that one summer, the sky itself cracked open with fire. Ash storms swept across the mining settlements, choking fields, blinding men, turning water supplies into sludge. Hundreds died in the mines, unable to breathe, their lungs filled with black dust. In that chaos, a group of miners rose up. They stormed the pits, armed with pickaxes and torches, intent on burning the place to the ground. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible. The gates splintered, overseers bled. Even the priest was dragged from his podium and stoned. But the rebellion was short. Starving, blinded, and desperate, they had no strength against the soldiers who arrived from the fortress above. Every rebel was thrown into the pits, not one by one but all at once. Hundreds of starving, dust-choked men and women forced into the sand, driven mad by thirst and fire. They tore each other apart until the last of them fell. The overseers called it a cleansing. The priest called it holy wrath. But the people gave it another name. They called it the day the sand wept. Some say you can still see it. If the lamps are turned low, dark stains that no blood, no ash, no sand can cover. A memory carved into the earth itself. It was then the pits ceased to be just a tool of power. They became legend. They became eternal. There is no sunrise in the pits. The first sound is not birdsong or bells, but the grinding of iron gates, the bark of overseers, the shuffle of chains. We wake in darkness, not because we slept, but because exhaustion is the only mercy left to us. Sleep is not rest here, it is collapse. The air is always damp. The walls sweat. The straw beneath our bodies rots faster than it can be replaced, crawling with lice and worms. If you are lucky, you sleep pressed against another body for warmth. If unlucky, that body dies in the night, and you wake with a corpse stiffening beside you. The overseers do not give us time to mourn. They drag the dead away before the rest of us can even whisper a prayer. The silence afterward is worse than the loss. Every removal reminds us that we are already half gone, that our names will vanish as easily as theirs. Breakfast is no feast. It is a ladle of gray gruel, more water than meal, served in cracked wooden bowls slick with mold. Sometimes there is a shard of meat in it, though we do not ask what animal or person it came from. Hunger makes us grateful for rot. Hunger makes us forget to question. We eat squatting on the stone floor, each one guarding their bowl like a predator. To glance too long at another's ration is to risk your teeth knocked out or a blade across your ribs. Kindness is punished not by the overseers but by the crowd of the starving. Hunger teaches us to hate each other before we can hate those above. When the bowls are empty, the real day begins. Part 2. The work of survival. Most believe the pits are only fighting, endless combat, blood spilled on sand. But that is only the stage, the performance for the crowds. The true labor is everything between. By daylight, if such a word has meaning here, we are sent to the tunnels. Picks in hand, we chip away at stone walls until our hands bleed anew. The mines feed the Imperium. We are reminded of this often. Your blood oils the gears of the galaxy. The overseers sneer. Die well, and the Emperor smiles. We dig not just but for distraction. The work keeps us weak, keeps us too tired to plot, too broken to resist. Every swing of the pickaxe drains the strength we might need in the arena. And that is the point. If you stumble, you are whipped. If you falter, you are whipped. If you fall and cannot rise, you are not whipped at all, for you are already marked for the pits that evening. The tunnels echo with curses, prayers, and coughing. The dust fills our lungs until each breath rasps like torn cloth. Some of us wear rags over our mouths. Most cannot afford even that. Yet even in the dark, we speak in murmurs. Small words of barter, quiet trades, a broken nail here, a strip of cloth there. In the absence of coins, scraps of survival become currency. One man carries a sliver of soap. He trades its use for half a ration. Another has hidden a bent spoon, precious beyond measure, for it can dig faster than a rock. Women barter songs, voices carrying through the tunnels in ghostly strains of old hymns. Songs can fetch food even in hell. Part 3. Rituals of the arena. When the overseers grow bored of work, they turn their gaze to the sand. Every evening, when the lamps burn brightest and the dust settles thick, names are called. There is no pattern to the calling. Some are chosen after days, others after years. A man may fight 5 nights in a row while his brother rots in the cells untouched. The randomness is its own cruelty, keeping us on the edge of dread. When your name is spoken, you rise. You do not beg. You do not plead. To do so is worse than death. The crowd jeers cowardice louder than it cheers bravery. Before the gates, there are rituals. Some sharpen their blades endlessly, even when the edge is already keen, as if repetition alone could conjure safety. Others carve marks into their flesh, one line for each fight survived. There are men so scarred they are little more than walking manuscripts of pain. Some pray to the Emperor, some pray to darker gods. Most simply mutter to themselves, repeating the same phrase until the gate opens. Not me, not yet. Then the lamps flare, the gate creaks, and you step into the sand, heart pounding so loud it drowns the roar of the crowd. Every day ends the same way, in sweat, blood, and silence. The survivors stagger back to the cells, too exhausted to speak. The losers are dragged away, faceless, nameless, consumed by the sand. We tell ourselves we are alive, but deep down, we know the truth. We are only waiting our turn. The arena is not the only place of death. The overseers delight in inventing smaller punishments, reminders that suffering is not reserved for the sand. The lash is the simplest, a strip of wire-bound leather that peels skin like fruit. For minor offenses, a dozen strokes. For greater ones, until the whip itself breaks. Then there are the cages. Iron boxes barely large enough to kneel in, left hanging above the pits. The sun bakes them in the day, the cold gnaws them by night. Men placed there emerge either dead or raving. Sometimes the overseers forget to remove them, and the stench of rotting flesh hangs over the fights. Water is the most common tool. Not drowning, that would be swift, but withholding. 3 days without a drop, and a man will crawl across the stones like an animal, licking condensation from the walls. The overseers laugh as we fight each other for spilled bowls. But the worst punishment is the silence. The times when the overseers say nothing, do nothing, and simply watch. We break ourselves with paranoia, turning on each other, inventing crimes where none exist. It is then that trust dies quickest. We learn to keep our eyes down. We learn not to speak too loudly, not to linger too close, not to hope too openly. Survival is not about strength here. It is about invisibility. Part 5. Faith, mad and pure, yet even here, faith survives. Every morning, some still kneel in the filth, crossing their chests, whispering the catechisms of hate, praising the God Emperor for granting them another day. Their voices tremble with hunger, yet they believe. They believe the Emperor watches. They believe that dying in the sand is his will. Others mock them. If the Emperor loves us, they hiss, why does he chain us? But the mockers never laugh for long. Mockery draws attention, and attention is death. Still, faith mutates in the dark. We see visions in the stone. We hear voices in the tunnels. Some claim the Emperor speaks to them in dreams, promising release. Others claim to hear different voices, whispers sweet as honey, offering strength, freedom, vengeance. The priests tell us those whispers are heresy, the tongue of the enemy. But when a starving man hears a voice promising water, does he care who speaks it? We begin to notice marks, scratched symbols, crude offerings of blood. Not all are imperial. Some are stranger, twisted, made from circles and knives and flames. The priests denounce them, yet the overseers look the other way. Perhaps even they are afraid. And so the pits breed not only fighters, but believers. Some cling to light, some fall to shadow. Most of us drift somewhere in between, praying to anything that might listen. Part 6. The flicker of humanity. It would be easy to say kindness died here, that the pits stripped us of everything but fear. But that would not be true. Sometimes, when the overseers are not watching, someone shares a crust of bread, a drop of water, a word of comfort. Such acts are dangerous, for mercy is weakness, and weakness is punished. But they happen all the same. I remember one night when a boy, barely grown, trembled at the gate. He had never held a blade. His eyes were wide, his breath quick. I pressed my hand to his shoulder and told him a lie. You will be fine. Just keep moving. He died within minutes, but he died believing someone cared. Another time, a woman stitched my wounds with a splinter of bone and a strip of her own ragged shirt. She asked for nothing in return. She was called to the sand the next night. She did not return. Yet I carry her memory still, proof that not all light is extinguished here. It is these flickers that hurt the most, because they remind us of what we were before the chains, before the hunger, before the endless roar of the crowd. And when such kindness is crushed, as it always is, it teaches us the cruelest truth of all. The pits do not merely kill the body. They kill the idea of being human. The pits are not simply where men die. They are where men live, if the word live can be used for what we endured. Days blurred together, the measure of time marked only by the scraping of chains and the opening of gates. There was no sun in the cages beneath the arena, only the damp drip of condensation, the stench of mold, iron, and blood that never quite washed away. We slept where we fell, bodies pressed against cold stone, sometimes piled upon one another like corpses in a trench. There was no bedding, no warmth, only our own filth and the hollow sound of breath rattling through broken teeth. Food came rarely, and when it did, it was not food so much as gruel poured into rusted troughs. We ate like animals, clawing at one another for scraps, for a mouthful of sludge that tasted of grease and despair. Sometimes the slop contained meat, sometimes it contained bones, sometimes it contained things best left unnamed. You swallowed quickly and prayed it wouldn't kill you before the next fight did. Water was rationed worse than food. A ladle dipped into a bucket, passed from hand to hand. By the time it reached you, it was often half empty, filled with spit or blood. Thirst hollowed us more than hunger ever could, and men licked condensation from the stones just to wet their tongues. Each morning, or what we assumed was morning, we were driven from the cages, lined up in rows, and forced to stretch our arms out to receive the overseer's lash. It wasn't punishment. It was routine. They said it kept us sharp, kept our senses alive, that pain was the only thing that reminded us we were still men and not cattle. We bled for them before the fighting even began. Some of us tried to cling to faith. A few whispered the emperor's name when the guards weren't listening, muttering prayers through cracked lips. Others carved crude aquilas into the stone with their fingernails until their fingers bled. But faith in the pits was a dangerous thing. If the wrong man overheard you, you'd wake with your throat cut. Not by a guard, but by another desperate prisoner who wanted to earn favor with the overseers. Entertainment came not in the form of joy, but in watching others unravel. Madness was common. Men laughed to themselves in the dark, singing songs that no one remembered but everyone hated. Some carved faces into the walls, companions made of shadows and scratches. A few found humor in our misery, mocking the guards until their tongues were cut out. Those who broke completely were thrown into the arena without weapons, naked but for their chains, to die screaming while the crowd howled. And yet, in rare moments, something like humanity flickered. A scrap of bread passed quietly to a dying man. A whispered story from someone who claimed to have seen sunlight once. A half-remembered lullaby, sung to calm a boy no older than 15 before his first fight. Small mercies, but mercies nonetheless. But kindness was dangerous too. If the guards saw it, both giver and receiver paid the price. A kindness caught was punished by dragging both into the arena, chaining them together at the ankle, and forcing them to fight side by side against beasts or worse. Bonds of loyalty turned into shackles of death. That was daily life in the pits. Pain for breakfast, fear for supper, and dreams filled with blood. Yet still we breathed, still we fought, still we endured. Because in the pits, death was always waiting. The trick was not to meet him too soon. But that was only the surface, the routine. Behind it all lurked something far worse. The machinery that kept it running, the true power that fed upon our suffering. It began, as all things do in the Imperium, with whispers. A guard missing from his post. A prisoner who swore he saw shadows moving where no torch burned. A low hum in the stone at night, like a voice speaking from deep below. First, we thought it was madness. In the pits, madness was as common as lice. But then the whispers grew teeth. The first horror came not from chaos, but from hunger. A week passed without rations. The overseers said nothing, only watched. Men fell on each other like beasts, fighting over scraps of bone that had already been gnawed bare. I saw one man slit another's throat for a strip of leather, chew it until his gums bled, and still smile as though he'd feasted. The overseers laughed from above, taking notes, as if cataloging livestock behavior. But that was only the beginning. Soon after, a warp storm cut across the region. We knew it not by sight but by sound. The air itself groaned, metal shrieked, and the walls wept condensation that smelled of copper. At night, the lights failed, and in the dark came visions. Men dreamed of their mothers, their wives, their homes, but always twisted. A child with hollow eyes, a spouse with teeth too sharp. The kind of dreams that made men wake screaming, only to find half the cage screaming with them. Then came the beasts. The chainmasters delighted in variety, and when the warp storm brought with it things clawed and half-real, they captured them rather than killed them. I remember the first fight, the gate opening, the smell of ozone, and then something crawling out that had too many legs, and none of them the same length. It moved wrong, like a picture half-smeared, and when it struck, it tore a man in half before the crowd could even cheer. We were thrown at it barehanded. The pit floor ran with blood that day, and still the thing was only wounded before vanishing into smoke. The overseers laughed, calling it a training exercise. But worse still were the nights the crowd demanded spectacle beyond monsters. They demanded madness. 2 cages would be opened at once, spilling their contents into the pit. Dozens of half-starved men forced to fight not for freedom but for the chance to die slower. Friends turned against each other, brothers, fathers against sons. And when the last one still stood, the overseers would clap and throw down a rusted blade for him to slit his own wrists in tribute. Refusal only meant dogs were loose to tear him apart. Every horror escalated. Every cruelty fed into the next. The walls began to pulse with heat as if the arena itself was alive. Some swore they heard chanting in the stone, low and droning. The chainmasters encouraged it, painting runes on the walls in blood, calling it decoration. But we knew better. Something was stirring beneath us. And when the first man began to change, when his flesh bubbled and twisted, when his screams turned into gurgling laughter, we realized the pits were no longer merely a theater of cruelty. They were becoming something else, something worse, a feeding ground for the warp itself. And once the warp had tasted us, there would be no going back. The very tools we used, the weapons and symbols, became part of the corruption that consumed us. The pits were never meant to arm us. Weapons were not gifts. They were insults, jokes wrapped in iron and blood. Every blade, every cudgel, every shard of rusted steel we were handed was chosen not to protect us, but to entertain the crowd. The most common tool was the scrap blade, a length of jagged metal hammered into something that vaguely resembled a sword. It bent in the first strike, broke in the second. To wield it was to gamble that your opponent's blade would snap before yours did. Some men sharpened the edges on the stone floor at night, carving their own palms bloody in the process. Most didn't bother. It was the killing, not the weapon, that mattered. There were nets, too, rotting, heavy, stinking of mildew. The overseers loved to see men tangle themselves more than their enemies. I once saw a fighter choke himself in his own net while the crowd howled. He strangled slowly, eyes bulging, while his opponent simply watched, too terrified to interfere. The guards dragged both corpses out afterward and tossed the net back into the cage for the next fight. Shields were rarer still, and when they appeared, they were made of wood so rotted that splinters buried themselves deeper than enemy blades. A shield was never protection. It was theater, something to break, something to shatter for the cheer of the mob. And then there were the specials. A rusted chain's word missing half its teeth, coughing sparks like a dying hound. A lost pistol with 1 charge cell, handed to a man against 5 opponents. A flamer with no fuel, nothing but weight to drag a man down. These were the jokes the overseers played, dangling the illusion of power, then snatching it away. Yet the most terrifying weapon was not forged of metal, but of faith. Some fighters smeared their faces with ash, muttering prayers as though words could blunt steel. Others carved crude symbols of chaos into their flesh, hoping the gods would grant them strength. The overseers encouraged both, laughing as men painted themselves in marks they barely understood. Faith was just another form of entertainment here, another tool to divide us. Symbols mattered in the pits. Chains were more than restraints, they were the emblem of our existence. Some men kissed their shackles before battle, calling them lucky. Others tried to break them, only to be flayed alive for the attempt. Blood was a language too. Fighters drew patterns on their bodies with their own wounds, trying to become something greater than men. Most just became corpses, painted red for the arena floor. There was dark humor in it all. A man once entered the pit armed with nothing but a spoon. The overseers had taken his nails, his teeth, his dignity, but they left him that. He killed 2 men before the handle snapped, stabbing into an eye and twisting until brain leaked through the socket. The crowd loved it. They cheered the spoon man until their throats were raw, and for weeks afterward, the overseers threw spoons into the cages like gifts. But irony cuts sharper than steel. Every weapon we were given, every tool of death, carried meaning we did not choose. They were reminders that we were not warriors, not soldiers. We were puppets, forced to dance for the amusement of those above. And the strings they pulled were made of rust, bone, and blood. Yet tools can shape men even in mockery, and the more we fought with their toys, the more we turned them against each other. Symbols became sparks, sparks became flames, and flames always draw eyes. And soon, the flames of rebellion, betrayal, and resistance began to flicker within the pits, though such fire always burned us first. It is strange to speak of community in a place designed to strip it away. And yet, even in the pits, men clung to one another because the alternative was madness. We slept shoulder to shoulder, backs pressed together for warmth. We whispered stories of home, even if most were lies. A shared lie could feel like truth if enough of us believed it. But the overseers hated this. They did not want men, they wanted meat. And so they salted every bond with suspicion. Betrayal was rewarded. A man who reported a prayer to the emperor was given a scrap of bread. A man who whispered of escape and then revealed the plan to the guards might get a jug of water to himself. It was enough. Men turned on each other for less. I saw a father betray his son for the promise of a week without the lash. He wept as he did it, but still he did it. The overseers clapped. Small kindnesses, when they bloomed, were strangled. Once, a fighter broke his ration biscuit in half and gave it to a boy too young for the arena. The next morning, both were dragged into the pit, chained together. They were made to fight beasts side by side until the boy's body was torn apart. The man who had shared his bread survived long enough to watch him die, then was cut down too. The message was clear. Mercy was treason. And yet, resistance flickered. Not open rebellion, no, that was impossible. But quiet, hidden defiance. A sip of water shared in darkness. A warning whispered before a raid. Men teaching each other tricks to last longer in the pit. How to move so a blade struck ribs instead of lungs. How to fall limp so the crowd thought you were dead. How to keep breathing when every gasp burned. These were our weapons. Not swords, not shields. Secrets. Patience. Survival. There were those who collaborated fully, of course. The crowd loved them, the ones who killed eagerly, who bowed to the overseers, who played the role of monster so well that they almost became it. The pit lords, we called them, men who forgot they were men. They ruled the cages with cruelty to match the guards, taking the choicest scraps, beating those too weak to resist. But even they were tools. The overseers kept them alive only as long as they entertained. The moment they faltered, the crowd demanded their blood, and the pit lords died screaming like the rest of us. We learned from that. Collaboration was a mask that could be useful, but wear it too long and it fused to your face. The truth was simple. Trust was the rarest currency in the pits. You could trade flesh, water, scraps of food. But trust could get you killed. And still, some of us risked it. Because without trust, even for a moment, a man was already dead. But trust came at a price. And sometimes, when it was paid, the cost was corruption. For the warp was watching us, whispering in our ears, feeding on our betrayals and our resistance alike. And soon, its touch would no longer remain hidden. The first signs were subtle, or perhaps we only told ourselves they were. In the dark, men twitched in their sleep, whispering words that belonged to no tongue we knew. Fingers scraped against stone, drawing spirals without realizing it. Eyes flickered in the torchlight, reflecting colors no fire should ever make. At first, we blamed hunger, thirst, madness. But hunger doesn't make a man's skin ripple as though something beneath it is trying to claw its way out. Thirst doesn't make a man laugh while his own teeth fall loose from his gums. The warp was seeping into the pits. The overseers noticed, of course. They encouraged it. They called such men blessed. They threw them into the arena first, naked and unarmed, against scores of enemies. Sometimes they were torn apart before they could change further. Other times the change came fast. I once saw a man split down his middle and instead of dying, two halves pulled themselves together, wriggling like worms into a single grinning thing. The crowd cheered so loudly the stone trembled. The corruption was not always physical. Some lost their minds before their flesh. They began to speak with voices not their own, words dripping like oil. They promised salvation, glory, freedom, if only we would listen. Some did. Some knelt. Some carved marks into their own skin and whispered prayers not to the emperor, but to something else. And why wouldn't they? The emperor never answered here. But the whispers did. They answered with power, however twisted. A broken arm that healed overnight. A blind man who suddenly saw too much. A starving prisoner who could fight for hours without tiring. His stomach growling but never empty. But power has a cost. Always. Those who accepted it were never the same. Flesh bubbled. Limbs grew too long. Eyes multiplied. One man's shadow turned against him, strangling him as he begged for mercy. Another's blood turned black, thick as tar, and when he bled it onto the arena floor, the ground smoked. The overseers didn't fear this. They worshipped it. They painted the walls with symbols, mixed blood into the mortar, and said it pleased the crowd. Maybe it did. Maybe the crowd above wasn't even human anymore. Maybe they were part of the same corruption, watching us twist and writhe like insects under glass. And so the pits became more than cages. They became altars. Every fight was a sacrifice. Every scream, a prayer. Every death, an offering. We told ourselves we were resisting, that we still had our minds, our souls. But in the pits, resistance and corruption were not opposites. They were the same. Both fed the warp. Both gave it what it wanted. And still we endured. Because the truth was too heavy to bear. There was no escape. Not from chains. Not from betrayal. Not from the warp. It had us body and soul. And yet, within that nightmare, stories emerged. Legends whispered in the dark. Tales of martyrs, traitors, and monsters who became more than men. And their fates were burned into us as warnings. The pits devoured men, but in devouring them, it left behind stories. We clung to these legends not because they gave us hope, there was no hope, but because they gave shape to our suffering. Every cage had its tales, passed from mouth to mouth, whispered in the dark like half prayers, half curses. The martyr of chains, they said he was a priest once, though by the time I saw him, he was nothing but bone wrapped in scars. His shackles were never removed, even in the arena. He fought with them still clamped around his wrists, swinging the chains like whips, breaking skulls with the iron. He refused to speak the names of the gods, either emperor or dark. When he finally fell, back broken, chest caved in, the crowd roared for his corpse to be mutilated. But something strange happened. His blood smoked, and the chains around his wrists burned white-hot until they snapped. The overseers panicked, dragging his body away. To this day, some swear that in the lowest cages, you can still hear the rattle of broken chains in the dark. The betrayer's feast, there was a man we called the Feastmaker. He survived more than anyone else, not because he was strong, but because he was clever and cruel. He betrayed friends, sold out escape plots, even poisoned rivals with mold scraped from the stones. He lived fat while the rest of us starved, his belly round where ours shrank to ribs. But the pits have no patience for gluttony. One night, the overseers chained him to a table in the arena and loosed starving men upon him. They tore him apart with their bare teeth. The crowd laughed as he screamed, choking on the same hunger he had used to feed himself. To this day, men whisper his name as a curse. May you feast as he feasted. The beast of ashes, no one knows if he was born in the pits or thrown there young. But by the time I fought beside him, he was more monster than man. He never spoke, only growled. His skin was tattooed in crude spirals of soot. His eyes bright with a madness that never dimmed. He fought like an animal, tearing with teeth as often as he struck with weapons. And yet, there was something more. When fire touched him, it did not burn. It clung, it curled, but he laughed through the flames, ash rising from his skin like smoke from a forge. The overseers kept him alive as long as they could, for the crowd adored him. In the end, it took an ogren with a hammer the size of a man to put him down. Some say he did not die, that he waits still, beneath the ashes of the arena floor. These legends were not heroes. They were warnings. The pits did not create champions. It created ghosts, curses, and nightmares that outlived the men themselves. We remembered them because we could not forget them. And in remembering, we saw ourselves reflected, what we might become, what we might already be. And when all the stories were told, when the last legend faded, there was only silence left, and the heavy truth of what it all meant. That truth was darker than chains, deeper than the pits themselves. The pits do not end. Not really. Not in the way the overseers or the priests would have you believe. They are eternal. A cycle of suffering, cruelty, and fleeting life that stretches on, indifferent to our prayers, our screams, our very existence. We endure because we must. Not for glory, not for faith, not for freedom. We endure because to stop is to vanish, and even the thought of nothingness is a terror greater than any lash, any beast, any blade. Every man who falls, every woman who screams, every child forced into the sand. Their suffering feeds the system, the warp, the machinery that watches us from the shadows. And yet, it is in that suffering that we find the tiniest threads of meaning. Not hope, not salvation, but truth. That we lived, that we fought, that we felt, however briefly, like human beings. We are shadows. We are whispers. We are blood and ash. The overseers count our deaths. The priests sanctify our screams. The warp drinks our madness. And still, in the cold hours before the lamps flare, we remember the taste of kindness, the whisper of a song, the fleeting warmth of a hand pressed against ours. There is no redemption here, no final triumph, no grand revelation beyond the one we already know. The Imperium does not care. The chaos that seeps into flesh and mind does not care. And the sand beneath our feet, the sand that will one day drink our blood, certainly does not care. We endure until we cannot. We fight until our hands break, until our lungs collapse, until our eyes are empty. And when we fall, the next man steps forward because the pits demand it, because the crowd cheers, because the world has no other mercy to offer. And so it goes. Day after day, century after century. The legends fade, the heroes rot, the martyrs are forgotten. Only the pits remain, eternal, insatiable, a mirror of the darkest truths of humanity. And when you leave this tale behind, remember this. If you ever hear the call of the arena, if you ever see the gates open before you, know that what awaits is not glory. What awaits is not honor. What awaits is truth. And that truth is far darker than any nightmare you have ever known. We endure. We bleed. We die. And the pits live on.